Good morning, friends. School of Tomorrow, futurists, designers, architects and engineers, polymaths, and so on. It's been a busy week. I've really enjoyed our get togethers. We had a big group in the backyard. This is my biggest meetup since the outbreak of the plague, COVID 19. Preview. Princeton's picked up the ball here on the Bucky stuff in a good way with Daniel Lopez Perez, and he addressed our Trim Tab book club. They've been reading it for a long time. Like, I just recently joined this book club, a discussion list, and we meet and have some presentations sometimes. I gave a presentation, but I'm more behind on this book, right? But our Buckminster Fuller pattern thinking. So that was what we were discussing, and the author was kind enough to join us. We didn't do a recording of that. I have a few screenshots from then, and they'll go like, it looked kind of like, you know how Zoom is, right? So we had good discussion. He showed us the contents of the book itself, which, like I say, I still need to get. Now, those get sharper after a second or two. All right, so onwards. I'm glad to see architecture department, which is where Fuller was kind of at home, picking up on the obvious, whereas in the philosophy department, it's up to trailblazers, you could say. So riffing on Rorty is where I'm connecting his Achieving Our Country with Fuller's Grunch of Giants kind of satire, and I'll go into more depth here in philosophy for children in terms of the greater arc, which is taking sort of liberalism and leftism before it became tainted, in Rorty's view, with Marxism. And instead, it's tracing back to, the consciences of Christians in, say, Boston with the Unitarians, turning into transcendentalists in some cases, departing from their Christianity in a sense, and that line between philosophy and religion that you can't really say you're doing a history of philosophy and not deal with that interface, right? Philosophy religion interface. You got to bring it up really to be thorough. And here we're doing that. In my writing, we're connecting Nietzsche to Emerson as we should, and Emerson to the whole conversation about how to best read the Bible, right? With Harvard in the forefront, with the new high criticism that they're getting from the German idealists, from Hegel and so on. In other words, we're still, like Rorty, tracing back to Hegel. We're just not tracing back to Marx as much. He was sort of a contemporary at best of these people, and therefore they didn't really have time to tune it in. All right, reading both of these would be, like Grunch of Giants and Achieving Our Country, would be an advised homework at this point. They're both short and they're both pithy, so I would say it's not super onerous to go through these and then to start thinking about and discussing their connections. Now, finally, I've been talking with Dick Fishbeck and reading Adrian's summaries of what's going on in certain animations and how these relate to, like in flat space or tiling, flatlands. You've got Joe Clinton here talking about tiling patterns and how the textbooks don't normally associate, ordinary planar tilings with rotational models, but they could, is his point. There's more or less um, to understand depending on whether you bring animation in, which you could call another dimension, right? The time dimension, flip frames, flip book, right? Time as passing frames. The film metaphor is one of my favorites. one I use for calculus as well. And also physics, because in a frame of action, lights, camera, action, and action, in the Newtonian idea of action, momentum um, times distance, MVD, that's kind of like a car just goes the tiniest amount, delta action over delta T is energy. All right. So we're looking again at edge counts, sphere density. In other words, closest packing of spheres, what's the density of that? These kind of topics. So geometry, so math. So what I'm talking about here is think of Princeton as a blob. Inside it has internal structure, architecture department, philosophy department, math department, literature department, history department. In terms of passing the torch in the 21st century, and coming from having invested in the fuller syllabus, you could call it, where and what goes to these different departments. And I've talked about the international school kind of diplomacy training I was getting at the so-called Woodrow Wilson School. That's what they called it. And that's where I actually did encounter Operating Manual for Spaceship Earth as an optional reading. But that in the 70s was like my one reference to Bucky at Princeton. It was after Princeton that because of Werner Erhard's EST program, I got tuned into the Bucky stuff, and that was a pattern for a lot of us. And there, the connection to Princeton is existence as well, because as I tell the story, Walter Kaufman is one of those who was influential in getting me prepared, interested in doing an S training like that in New Jersey while I was still at Princeton. For all I know, I could have written a thesis about it. That could have been my senior thesis, but I wasn't thinking that way. And I was a Wittgenstein guy, and I still am, so no mistakes in that regard. Everything's chugging along, basically, is the message of this video, and it's like an infall of rain, of interesting, relevant stuff. It's just aggregating, and I'm becoming more aware of more of it, all the time. And that's a good experience, right? So again, hey, thanks to Mark for the polymath page. I think we do really good there in terms of recruiting new students, interest among the polymaths. And thank you to others who are contributing to my life right now in the Flextegrity Garden here. And I'll be talking to David Koski here soon, I hope. All right, onward.